So in the last lecture we've written the loop, and we iterated through our posts and used template tags to get information about each post. So we checked that we have posts first using have posts, and then we mentioned that we should call a function called the post in order for template tags to work properly, and also in order to avoid an infinite loop. But we don't really know how these functions work, right? And in order to become a better developer and to be able to debug problems in your code, it's much better to understand what's going on behind the scenes. So to get posts from the database, WordPress has a very powerful PHP class called WP Query. This class accepts some query arguments and returns an object containing a lot of information and methods about this particular query. So let's say we want to create a widget that displays posts from a certain category. First, we will initialize a new instance of the WP Query class and pass it our query arguments. So in our case, we need to get the posts that have a category that has an ID of 4. Then we proceed and write the loop the same way we did in the last video, but this time we will call have posts as a method of the query instance, and same for the post function. We will also call it as a method of the query instance and not as a function like we did in the last video. And then we can use template tags the same way we did before. And that's actually not everything. We are writing a custom loop here, which is different from the main loop. So in this case we must call a function called WP reset post data. So notice that I said a custom loop and the main loop. So what's the main loop, and why did we write have posts and the post as functions and not as methods when we were writing the loop in the index.php file? And what is WP reset post data? To answer these questions, let's see what WordPress does when it receives a request. And by receives a request I mean, when you type a URL in the browser like the one you see. So for the URL we see, we are now requesting a page for a category called unicorns. So WordPress will go and find all posts with category unicorns, and that's what the main loop will loop through. So we've seen in the last slide, we defined a new variable and assigned it to a new instance of the WP Query class to get the posts. WordPress does the same thing. It figures out the query from the URL, and then it instantiates a new WP Query class and assign it to a global variable called WP Query. So the global WP Query now becomes the main query, and this loop is the main loop. Any other WP Query instances, like the one we did in the last slide, are secondary queries. And the reason we called have posts in index.php directly as a function and not as a method of a class instance is that we were looping through the main loop. And what the function have posts actually is, it's just a shortcut function that calls the method have posts for the global WP Query class instance. So this is the source code for the have posts function, and it's essentially the same thing we did when we were writing our custom query, but now we're calling have posts for the global WP Query instance. I know this might sound a bit confusing to some of you, so let's go back to index.php. And when we wanted to create a custom loop, we created a variable, let's call it custom. And then we instantiated a new instance of the WP Query class. And now to loop through the posts of the custom WP Query instance, we call have posts as a method of the custom instance, right? But now that we are looping through the main loop, we just have to call the function have posts. And what the function have posts will do, it will call the have post method on the global variable WP Query. So if we type here in the if condition have posts of the class instance WP Query, the global variable WP Query, it's exactly the same thing. Have posts is just a wrapper function or a helper function that calls the method have posts on the global WP Query, and same for the post function. So this is basically exactly the same thing as when we created a custom query only this time WordPress is responsible for creating the WP query instance depending on the URL. So I'm now using the var dump function to display the global WP query object. We would like to know what this object will contain. What will it look like? So if we refresh now the browser, as you can see, it's a very large object. So let's view this in a more formatted way. So let's add pre-tags around the var dump here. And let's take a look now. It's much clearer now. And as you can see, if we, for example, visit a category, let's say unicorns, we will now have some query vars, as you can see. And if we scroll down, we will find a key of posts, and this key will contain all the posts that the WP query class found. So here it is, and as you can see, it's an empty array, probably because this category does not exist. But if you go back now to the main page and see the same key, it's an array of 11 posts. So I hope now it's clear the difference between the main query and any other custom query that we write. So now that we've seen the WP query object in the browser, and it looked something like this. This is just a short version of it. So this object had some information like the query vars and the post count. It also had a key called current post, and it's initially -1. And it had the array of posts found, and it also had a key called post, which is a post object. So let's now try to visualize what happens to these values when we start our loop. So imagine we have our main loop here on the left, and we have the global WP query object on the right, which contains, as we saw in the last slide, the post count, the current post, an array of posts, and the post. So let's assume now we found 2 posts for this query. So the post count will be 2, and the posts array will have 2 posts, and the current post will be initially -1, and the post will be the first post in the posts array. And we also have another global variable, which is post. Remember when we were discussing template tags, and we mentioned that if you did not pass a post ID to the template tag, it will get its value from a global variable called post. So this is it. And initially its value will be the same as the post key in the WP query object. So it would also be post1. So let's go ahead now and trace the loop step by step and see how the values on the right will be affected. So the first line here, if have posts, as we mentioned before, the have posts function will call the have posts method on the WP query global object. And this method inside the WP query instance will compare the post count and the current post. So the condition will be is current post +1 less than post count. So in our case is 0 less than 2, which is true. So have posts will return true. In the next line, while have posts, so while 0 less than 2, which is true. So we will enter the loop and move to the post. The post will also call a method called the post on the WP query global object. And what this method will do is that it will increment the current post. So the current post now will be 0. And then it will set the post object to the first post in the post array. So the key post in the WP query object is now equals to post1, and also it will set the global post variable to post1. And now we'll move to the title. The title without any ID provided will go to the global post object and get its title from there. And this way we got the title of post1. In the second iteration, now current post is 0. So the condition will be is 1 less than 2, which is true. So we will go to the post. The post will call the post method in the WP query object, and this method will increment the current post by 1, and it will also set the post inside the WP query object and the global post variable to the second post in the posts array. So now they will be post2. So now when we move to the next step and call the title, the title will go to the global post variable and it will get the title of the post saved there, which is post 2. And that's how the template tags get the right value without passing an ID to them. So now finally, in the last iteration, we will have a condition 2 less than 2, which is false. So the loop will now be finished. So I think it's clear now how the loop works. So remember in this slide when we were writing a custom WP query, and we mentioned that in any custom WP query, you must call a function called WP reset post data when you are done with the loop, right? So now we need to know why do we call this function when we are writing a custom WP query. So imagine we are displaying a template for a single blog post. So if you have a list of posts and you click on one of them, you'll go to a page that will display more information about this post. So this is the single blog post. So in this case, the WP query global object will only contain one post, because we're not fetching a category or an archive, we're just fetching one post. So now the post global object will be the first and the only post in the post array in the WP query global object, right? So now let's say we want to display the post title, so we will call the title. The title will go to the global post object and it will get its title from there. And maybe you also would like to display the content, so we will call the content, which will also go to the global post variable and get the content of this post. Now imagine we want to display the related posts for this post. Now we will have to write a custom query. This query will maybe get the posts that share the same category as the main post. So notice now that when we start to loop in this custom query, we will set the global post object to the first post in this custom query. And as we move forward, we will set it to the second post in the custom query, and so on. Now imagine after the related posts, we would like to get the category for the main post, for the original post. You see the problem? The category template tag will go to the global post object, but it will have the wrong post. It will have the last post in our custom query. So that's why we call WP reset post data after any custom query, to set the global post object back to the original post, right? So let's now take a quick look on some of the source codes for some of the WordPress functions that we saw. It's always a good idea to do that, to maybe have a better understanding of what's going on behind the scenes. So here we have the have posts function, and we've seen that before. It just calls the have posts method in the WP query global object. So let's take a look at the have posts method in the WP query class. And what it does, as we saw in the loop visualization, it compares the current post plus 1 with the post count, and if that's true, it returns true. Otherwise it does some other things. We don't have to go into more details for now. Let's take a look now at the post function, and one of the things that it does is that it calls another method called next post, and next post is responsible for incrementing the current post, as we saw. And it also, remember, we had a property called post in the WP query instance, so this function will set this post to the current post in the loop. So we have the array of posts, it will set it to the index of the current post, right? And it will also return the current post. We also have the title and get the title. You can have a look at these, but I just want to show you reset post data. So we've seen in the previous example that we can write our custom query that will override the global post object, right? And this might cause some bugs, as we saw in the example. So we use the WP reset post data function, which will call a method called reset post data in the WP query class. So what this method will do, it will reset the global post variable to this .post. And this dot post, let's go back to the next post function. This dot post will contain the current post in the WP query global instance, right? So this will be the current post in the loop, the original post. So I hope this makes sense to you. Take your time and read these source codes. And maybe, I know this lecture might be kind of confusing to some of you. I think rewatching this lecture might make it a lot more clear. So that's it for now. See you in the next lecture.